Well, ka nui te mihi kia koutou, kia ora, good afternoon everyone. Can I just say thank you again for the opportunity to come and talk with you today. Can I say first up, thank you so much for what you do as business leaders. I know it's an incredibly difficult and challenging time to be leading at this moment, but I also want to say thank you very much for the engagement that we've had as government and industry working together rather than us doing it to you, is the way we've wanted to work with you with respect to the way we're building our response to the fuel crisis that we've been working with many of you in this room, and we really do appreciate everything that you're doing with us. Can I just acknowledge you, Tracy, and say thank you for coming with me on so many delegations over the last 2 years as well. And to Karen from Salesforce, thank you for sponsoring the event and the contributions that you make also to government in particular. Before I begin, can I just acknowledge Business New Zealand's CEO, Catherine Rich. She can't be with us today, she's struggling with COVID, but I just want to acknowledge Catherine and also Business New Zealand's leadership in general, and just say thank you. Thank you for your support on the Indian FTA that was so critical to helping us finalise the FTA and bring it into life. And so on behalf of all Kiwi exporters, large and small, thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, look, today's been officially billed as a pre-budget speech, and I'll touch on the budget and our priorities this year a little later on. But certainly in a more volatile world, and off the back of the recent trip to Singapore, I'd really like to take the opportunity to speak to you today on a bigger, broader topic, both in my capacity as Prime Minister and also as National Party leader. And I'd like to speak to you today about where New Zealand stands in the world, a volatile world, a world that's changing very quickly and becoming less predictable, and how we need to adapt and respond and secure our own country's future. The Indo-Pacific region is the most economically dynamic region on Earth. It will generate 2/3 of global economic growth over the coming years. By 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle class will be living in our region. But there's actually another side to this. Something important has changed in how global power works, and we need to be really honest about what we see. And put quite simply, our world is facing 3 big challenges. First, we're moving from a world ordered by rules to one ordered by power. Countries are shifting from working together under international law to more transactional relationships without shared rules. And in this setting, stronger nations do as they please, and smaller countries have to adjust. Second, international relations are moving from an economic focus to one dominated by security concerns. Competition now means cyber attacks, disinformation, supply chain coercion, and grey zone operations are primary tools of statecraft. And thirdly, we're moving away from a world that valued efficiency, like lean supply chains and borderless capital, to one that now puts national resilience first. And I think the examples are obvious to us all. The United States, which supported the global order for 80 years, is now focusing more exclusively on its own view of its own interests, America first. Russia has made its brutal intentions clear in Europe, reminding the continent that territorial conquest is not a relic of history. And China is assertively expanding its influence across the Indo-Pacific and beyond. A world where hard national interests are being pursued by hard national power. An unsentimental world, a world where many of the rules that have helped keep us safe and prosperous are contested and sometimes ignored. And a world where centres of power are ever more distributed, and where countries in the global south, in Africa, in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and our own Pacific neighbourhood are also no longer willing to remain passive in a system that they didn't help design. And their desire for a greater say in global affairs is justified. So this is the world that New Zealand must now navigate, not with fear, but actually with clear eyes and a willingness to make different choices than in the past. We are living through an inflection point in history, and for now, a new multipolar international system appears to be emerging, although the outcome is yet fully determined. And as a small nation, without the means to assert ourselves diplomatically or economically, New Zealand has benefited hugely from the system of rules that has been built up through the multilateral system. We've helped build it. In fact, we have a long record of continuing to invest in its development. Our values, our trade, our security all depend on that multilateral foundation. And so alongside our friends and partners, we must keep working to protect it and also to remake it. When you turn on the news at night and you see the alliances straining, you see trade wars flaring, you see rules being rewritten by the powerful, it's only natural to feel as though the ground is shifting beneath you. You know, it can seem to all of us as though the world that we knew and our parents knew is becoming unfamiliar, harder to interpret, and beyond our control. And I hear those concerns and feel them too, and I want to be honest with you about this instead of just giving some empty reassurances. But let me also stress this, because we have faced similar challenges before and we have overcome them. I just want you to consider for a moment the New Zealanders who have come before us. Think about the generation that lived through the First World War. They witnessed a world that they believed to be civilised fall into absolute chaos. Empires collapsed, 10 million people died, and the old certainties about the order, progress and nature of Europe were shattered on the Western Front. Young men from this country, including my great-grandfather, left small towns and farms to cross oceans and fight in a conflict that they must have felt beyond their comprehension and control. And then they returned home and they rebuilt. And yet less than 20 years later, they faced another global conflict in the Second World War. They confronted fascism, a disciplined and well-resourced movement that conquered much of Europe and appeared in 1940 to be winning. And the outcome was not inevitable, it was not guaranteed. People were frightened, and they were right to be frightened. You know, they're called the greatest generation for a very good reason, because many of them were children of the Depression. They had already experienced hunger, loss and hardship, and then as the world began to recover, they were called upon to do the hardest thing imaginable. They answered that call. They went to Europe and the Pacific, and those at home here rationed and sacrificed and waited, often not knowing whether the letters would stop coming. But what made them great wasn't that they had no fear, it was that they understood deep down that freedom to live well, to raise your children in peace, to speak your mind, to choose your leaders, doesn't just last on its own. Someone has to stand up for it, and their generation did. But they didn't just win a war, they built the peace that followed afterwards. They built the hospitals and the schools here at home in New Zealand, and they created the international institutions designed to make sure it would never happen again. The very rules-based order we're now working to preserve, well, they built it. And they were, in short, not only warriors, but they were architects of a world that was, for all of its imperfections, more just, more prosperous, and more peaceful than anything that had come before. And then came the Cold War, 40 years of living with the threat of nuclear annihilation. And yet science advanced, democracy spread, and human rights improved. And in 1989, the wall came down, not because of war, but because of powerful ideas and the courage of ordinary people who refused to keep living a lie. Now, we are inheritors of what they built, and the question is whether we prove worthy of that inheritance. But history teaches us. It teaches us that the world has always had its inflection points, and those moments are always the most unsettling. That's when the dictators seek to dominate, that's when fear replaces reason, and it's when the urge to turn inwards is most strong. But they are also the moments that reveal character, the moments that actually determine what kind of world comes next. And so I say to you, I remain relentlessly optimistic. Despite the pressures of our age, we live in a time of extraordinary human capability. In just one generation, over 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. Child mortality rates that would have seemed impossible to all of our grandparents are now normal in much of the world. More people are educated and more women are involved in public life. The tools available to address our greatest challenges, such as clean energy and medical science and digital connectivity and agricultural technology, are more powerful than ever before. And so the Indo-Pacific is not just a region of risk, but it's also one full of great opportunity. And innovation and enterprise can be found from Auckland to Ahmedabad, from Tokyo to Timaru, and we see it across our whole region. In that context, small countries have often done well during times of change when they are coherent, when they are trusted, and when they stand for values and interests that are important to them. And New Zealand has its own version of that story. At our very best, we have always positioned ourselves on the right side of history. That's exactly who we are. So yes, the world is unsettled. The order that we've depended upon is under real pressure. And there are forces in global politics that none of us can fully control. But here's what we can control: how prepared we are, how resilient we are, and how well we stick together. We can't control the storm, but we can secure our future within it. And that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today. So in a more volatile and uncertain world, we've got to focus on controlling what we can control. And that starts right here at home. because for too long we have assumed that our location protects us, that an ocean and a quiet reputation are enough, and I can tell you they aren't. Geography gives us time, but it doesn't give us immunity. We've assumed our international relationships would carry us, and they matter enormously, but we must invest in them. They're not unconditional, and they are sustained by contribution. Partners support those who show they're willing to help themselves. We've also assumed large investments in renewable energy would insulate ourselves from energy shocks offshore. We've assumed that our economy would always bounce back, but as I've said before, New Zealand needs to get its finances in order for long-term growth. An economy that can't support itself in a crisis is a major risk, both strategically and financially. And maybe most importantly, we've assumed our social cohesion is a given, that New Zealanders will always stick together when times are tough. But history shows us that's not always true. Social trust isn't inherited, it needs to be built and it needs to be cared for and looked after. These issues aren't just academic, as I'm talking to you about them. They're actually really important issues that matter to Kiwis. Secure and affordable energy matters just as much for manufacturers here in Auckland as it does for mum and dads battling to keep up with the cost of living. Secure access to global markets matters just as much at the milking shed as it does for cutting-edge companies like Holter and Rocket Lab, competing on the global stage for capital and talent. And financial security matters just as much for Kiwis meeting the cost of a mortgage and planning for retirement as it does for governments worldwide grappling with the cost of borrowing. The bottom line, quite simply, is we can't have prosperity, more jobs, more exports and higher wages without having greater national security. And in 2026, risks to our energy security, our financial security, our international security and our social cohesion each threaten our future as a wealthy, inclusive and diverse trading nation in the South Pacific. And so each issue demands a coherent response, anchored in an overall objective of strengthening our collective national security for a more volatile and uncertain world. And so today I'd like to provide some guidance on my party's direction of travel on some components of that national security before speaking briefly about our priorities in this year's upcoming budget. So let's talk first about international security and our presence offshore. As I spoke about earlier, flagrant violations of national sovereignty, such as we've seen with Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and heightened great power competition in the Indo-Pacific, have each contributed to a more volatile and uncertain world. And as a small trading nation, we're disproportionately exposed. We have a strong voice, but in an era increasingly dictated by hard power, our choices are limited. Enhanced investment in our own defence capability is critical, allowing us to support both our own national security and also the wider resilience across the Indo-Pacific region. And in an era where trade and security are increasingly interrelated, investment in our defence capability also represents an investment in our economic security and our prosperity. And so if re-elected, National remains committed to continuing to implement our defence capability plan. That is to double our defence expenditure as a share of the economy and to prioritise interoperability of our defence forces with our only ally, Australia. But for a small country like New Zealand, our security depends as much on the system of rules, relationships and institutions that have developed over decades, as it does the size and the capability of our defence force. And that's why in this term of government, diversification of both trade and defence relationships, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, has been an urgent priority. Upgrades in our relationships with India and Singapore, closer cooperation with NATO's IP4 and ASEAN and our role in the Pacific Island Forum are each critical steps against a volatile international backdrop. And so we will continue to develop the lattice work of interlocking relationships, bilateral, regional, global, that together provide depth and resilience for New Zealand. In a more volatile world, some of our traditional friends and partners seem to be doing the same, forging new partnerships shaped by many of the values that we hold dear and their own support for the international rules-based system. The multilateral values and institutions that have underpinned our prosperity may be under strain, but they haven't yet perished, and we have to evolve and remake them. And New Zealand, with others, must continue that mission in the months and the years to come. So, for example, we will continue the work that we started last year to strengthen the dialogue between the EU and CPTPP trade ministers to reinforce the rules of international trade. And as Lawrence Wong and I discussed last week, where high standards can be met and New Zealand's interests are served, we will explore expanded signed arrangements between New Zealand and Singapore on trade and essential supplies with other countries potentially. Secondly, I want to talk about energy independence in the context of our national security, because New Zealand's energy vulnerability is no longer a theoretical risk. It's a live crisis on full display in the Strait of Hormuz every single day. And every week I get the great privilege of speaking to farmers and growers and manufacturers and truck drivers and tradies who have seen their lives and their businesses affected by events half a world away. And it's not just the rough and tumble impact of globalisation, because on too many occasions, private capital, eager to bolster domestic energy production, has been pushed to the sidelines by overzealous planners and politicians in recent years. Several high-profile projects are now getting underway thanks to our reforms like Fast Track, which I expect will continue to grow in popularity by leaps and bounds. But the reality is that when faced with an energy shock after energy shock, it's very hard to justify backing the skink over the solar farm. And so other regulatory handbrakes, like the ban on oil and gas exploration, have been more permanently chilling. And as a government, we're going to continue to pursue strategic energy reserves and options like LNG, like the strategic coal reserve at Huntly, and the recent procurement of 90 million litres of diesel to be stored at Marsden Point. And yes, each of those options are costly, but less costly than the alternative of regular but ultimately unpredictable shortages. And so more action is required. Energy independence must be treated as an immediate national security interest instead of a contributing factor to a long-term climate strategy. We will never compete on the global technological frontier in an AI world without abundant, affordable energy. And the manufacturers I've spoken to here in Auckland, they're right. The government does need to have a role in acting deliberately and forcefully to achieving that outcome. Third thing I want to talk about is, in the context of national security, is social cohesion. Because ultimately our greatest strategic asset is the trust that New Zealanders have in each other and in our institutions. Disinformation exploits division, and adversaries will always probe our social fault lines looking for leverage. But recent years have brought new pressures. During COVID, ministers given extraordinary powers by the Parliament too often prioritised their own political interests over the interests of the public in honest and open government. The media, determined to flatten New Zealand's relative performance, also failed, accelerating a long decline in public trust and confidence. And since then, failed immigration policies in Europe and North America have also stoked a politics of division online. And despite prudent policies and the natural advantages of geography, immigration now seems to be an emerging political issue in New Zealand too. Holding our society together under all of those pressures will be challenging. But as the MP for Botany, I represent a part of New Zealand which is more diverse than most. Thousands of Chinese, Korean, Malaysian and Indian Kiwis call Botany home. Kiwis who work hard, who volunteer, who serve their community and make an immense contribution. They're the kids who play cricket with your sons and daughters, school teachers, business owners, doctors and nurses, and Kiwis who frankly deserve better than being unfairly and unreasonably vilified. But that only works when we have a smart, targeted and fair immigration system that serves New Zealand's interests. And it's worth acknowledging that at least some of the political fracturing evident in Europe in recent years reflects politicians refusing to implement the preference of their voters on immigration. Earlier this year, Erica Stanford spoke on many of the recent changes that we've made to strengthen our immigration system, designed to prioritise skilled, not unskilled workers and migrants through higher English language requirements, more enforcement and tougher penalties. And the temporary work visas granted under the Indian FTA are anchored in that approach, with visas available for specific occupations where we have the workforce shortages. It's an issue we'll watch closely, and you should expect to see careful policy on immigration from National as we get closer to the election. And my message to the business community is that the truth is that when it comes to immigration, when faced with a choice between social cohesion and stability and your bottom line, I'll choose the former every single time. And finally, let's talk about our financial security in the context of national security, because the truth is that small countries which borrow money from offshore can only live on credit for so long. Eventually the bill has to and must be paid. And with rating agencies and bond markets increasingly suspicious of Western governments' political courage to address long-term fiscal challenges and pressures, the bill is only likely to become more expensive in coming years. And too many countries, including New Zealand, spent the post-COVID period dining out on fiscal headroom accumulated by previous generations of political leadership. In recent years, our government has run tight budgets in a deliberate effort to chart a path back to surplus. Crises offshore have certainly made that path much harder. But we must stay the course because our status as a high-income nation is not a historical certainty. Fiscal credibility is a precondition of our prosperity and therefore our national security. In this year's budget, we're going to continue prioritising and maintaining that credibility. Budget 2026 is about securing New Zealand's future. Fiscal repair, balanced with careful capital investment, features heavily in that story. The good news is that with the budget now officially signed off, I can confirm a few details today. First, the government's fiscal strategy underpinning that approach and our commitment to achieving it remains unchanged. The government remains committed to putting debt on a downward path towards 40% of GDP and returning the books to surplus by 2028-2029. Achieving that will be a tall order and it will require careful choices in the years to come. But responding to the current fuel crisis, a crisis of national resilience and economic security through more spending, just risks leaving New Zealand even more exposed in the years ahead. So in that spirit, I can confirm the Minister of Finance will once again keep new spending in the budget below the operating allowance previously set at the budget policy statement. This year I'm pleased to say that the net operating package in the budget will be $2.1 billion, or around $300 million smaller than the $2.4 billion allowance set in December despite the recent crisis. And that's achievable because while we continue to invest in essential services like health and education for the third year running, we've also been able to achieve significant savings across government. At the same time, while we continue to prioritise a return to surplus, the recent crisis has acted as a timely reminder that significant levels of capital investment are going to be required in the coming years to build out that national security, to build a more modern, resilient infrastructure able to withstand an increasingly volatile world, to develop a defence force which is fighting fit and capable of keeping Kiwis safe and safeguarding our region from malign interference, and to invest in the schools and the hospitals that New Zealanders rely on to receive modern, responsive public services. So in that spirit, this year's capital package will be larger than originally planned at a net $5.7 billion. That doesn't reflect a permanently higher rate of borrowing. We'll need to get the balance right in the years ahead as we rebuild our fiscal and financial buffers. Finally, promoting financial security isn't just about the government's financial position. The truth is, if we're really honest with ourselves, is we don't save nearly enough and we rely too much on money borrowed from overseas to support our lifestyles. And that must change. Government's role must shift from simply meeting the rapidly growing cost of New Zealand's superannuation, to which we remain very, very committed, to a stewardship role for New Zealanders' financial security, supporting greater levels of private savings and investment. In last year's budget, you saw us agree to lift KiwiSaver contributions from 3% to 4%. And we said in November last year, if Nationals re-elected, we intend to lift contributions further to 6% each for employers and employees. Some commentators have recently recommended a further set of changes to support the long-term health of the scheme, several which have also been recommended in the past by the Retirement Commissioner. So National is considering all of those changes and will have more to say on our KiwiSaver policy soon. So in closing, there's a quote attributed to Pericles that has stayed with me. And it's quite simply said, just because you do not take an interest in politics doesn't mean that politics won't take an interest in you. And the same is true of the world order. We can choose not to pay attention to it, but it will not return the favour. We have what the world wants. We are a reliable and trusted partner. We have values worth defending and a future worth building. But none of that is guaranteed. It must be chosen and it must be worked for. And yes, the world is at an inflection point, and the question is not whether New Zealand is affected, it is. The question is whether New Zealand is ready. So today I'm asking you to help make us ready, not through fear, but through the deep, quiet confidence of a nation that knows what it stands for, knows who it is, and knows what it is capable of achieving. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for what you do. Appreciate you.